continuing with the sources of distortion in the West image of the Middle East, my next topic is the Cold War. The Cold War is very, very important in the history of the Middle East, modern history of the Middle East. If you remember, it was a battle of survival for us against a terrible foe that one of our presidents labeled as the evil empire. Now remember, a good chunk of the former Soviet Union is in the Middle East. That republic or that entity, the Soviet Union, housed close to 70 million Muslims. Also, a good part of the Cold War conflict between us and the Soviet Union was seen as our effort, the US effort, to contain the perceived Soviet expansion in the Middle East. Notice I said perceived, I didn't say Soviet expansion, because you will see as I argue later on, I don't believe that the Soviet Union had any master plan or blueprint to dominate the Middle East. And in fact, it pretty much ceded the control of the area to the United States. In the context of American domestic politics, it really didn't matter whether you were a hawk or a dove during this period. We believed that the Soviet Union was an expansionist power, an imperialist power, and in that context, Republicans or Democrats, doves or hawks, all believed in containing the evil empire. Now, even though the Cold War has been over for more than 2 decades, Middle East is a region that has been deeply impacted by the Cold War conflict. In other words, it would be appropriate to call the Middle East a Cold War impacted region. And the consequences of that impact really continues to ripple away into the post-Cold War period. In other words, modern political history of the Middle East has been profoundly affected by the conflict that was fought mostly there in the Middle East. Remember, United States and Soviet Union never directly confronted each other with their armies or with their military. The battles were fought in other people's land, mostly in the Middle East, because Middle East was considered the strategic prize of the area. Today, the Middle East remains arguably the most dangerous region in its capacity to ignite international conflict. One of the testimony to this claim is the first post-Cold War conflict, the war with Iraq. Actually, that conflict straddles the Cold War and the post-Cold War. By the time it began, Soviet Union was in the process of disintegration. And again, this war was followed by a war in Afghanistan. And then we had another war in 2003 with Iraq, and now we are looking at the possibility of war with Iran. In other words, there is no question that Middle East is one of the most dangerous spots in the world. There are, in the meantime, many, many unresolved conflicts that are still playing themselves out simultaneously. So, Cold War has been a tremendous influence in the way we have viewed the Middle East. It made us think of the Middle East as a strategic prize rather than people with their own desire for independence. And our aim was to make sure the prize stays with us, not with our enemy, the evil empire or the Soviet Union. Throughout the lectures, I will come back to this theme, trying to identify in much more specific terms how the Cold War impacted the shape of politics in the Middle East and how it influenced our policies there. The next source of distortion is the energy crisis. It began, or at least we took note of it, in the aftermath of the 1973 Arab-Israeli conflict. What happened was that Saudi Arabia and Egypt worked things together, and they decided that they're going to punish the United States for its support for Israel. As a result, they began an oil embargo to the United States. Looking at the impact that this embargo had on the United States, it was a period that really frightened us. In this period, we suddenly experienced shortage of gasoline. There were people in line waiting to fill up their cars, and suddenly we felt threatened. It was also during this period that we developed a very horrible image of the Arabs. We told ourselves, how dare these wealthy Arabs threatening our economic well-being and threatening our economic welfare. In fact, documents that have surfaced indicates that Kissinger took the threat so seriously that he actually had a contingency plan to invade Saudi Arabia and occupy the oil fields. So for about 6 months during the energy crisis, the Cold War was actually put on the back burner, and our focus was how to deal with this challenge. And our life really began to change. We couldn't drive as fast as we could. 55 miles per hour became pretty much the norm. So energy crisis did have an impact on making the Arabs seem more selfish to us and generating an ugly image of them. The next source is what I call direct American policy. In other words, how our policy and in turn responses or reactions from the region to that policy, they're all intertwined, how that has affected our imagery of the Middle Easterners. I think this is a very influential factor in how we see them. And perhaps pedagogically, it would be useful for me to begin the discussion of this topic by posing some riddles and trying to answer them. So let me begin with the first riddle. The first riddle really has to do with Anwar Sadat's image. Those of you who remember, Anwar Sadat was the president of Egypt. He was the first Arab president who decided to, Arab leader who decided to make peace with Israel. And much of the West certainly viewed him, especially in the United States, as a great man and as a wonderful statesman. In fact, to reward his statesmanship, he was awarded Nobel Prize for Peace. Now think for a moment. If this class was being held in Cairo, Damascus, Baghdad, Amman, or even in Tehran, how would the students there would see Sadat? The answer is not difficult. They would see him as a traitor. And they would see Camp David Accord that established peace between Egypt and Israel as a great calamity. So one of the things you have to find out by taking this course is why there is such a diversion of perception regarding someone as controversial as Sadat. When Sadat was assassinated by Islamicists, I was at the University of Pittsburgh, and I recall very distinctly that the Arab students were jubilant and celebrating. And that wasn't just in the United States, in the Arab population here, but that was true in much of the Middle East. In fact, I recall the CBS anchor at the time one Walter Cronkite had gone to Egypt to cover the burial ceremony of President Sadat, and he was shocked because he didn't see Egyptian mourning. The only place he saw Egyptians mourning for Sadat was Sadat's own village, who was a recipient of a lot of Sadat's largesse. The point that I'm making is that Sadat was not mourned in the Middle East. He was mourned in the West. So that should give you some clue about the divergence of perspective between us and the Middle Easterners. So you got to ask yourself, why do the Arab people, especially those that are considering themselves to be nationalists, or for that matter, the Islamicists, why do these people see Sadat as a traitor? So when we discuss Sadat, when we deal with Egypt, you should have some clues into this. The second riddle that I want to pose to you is the hostage crisis. Many of you may have seen the new movie that has been out dealing with the hostage crisis. What I want to bring up here is this. The question that we really never asked ourselves was, why do the Iranians hated us so much to try to humiliate us by taking the American diplomat as hostages? Now, one can write a one-page essay saying why that's the case. My point is different, though. We never really asked the question, in part because we have very little memory of what could have led to this kind of a reaction. Well, by the time of the midterm for this course, you will have an answer to this riddle. The third riddle that I want to pose is the United States policies in Afghanistan, because that policy really captures the contradictory reaction we have had to political Islam. In Afghanistan, in December of 1979, when Soviet Union invaded the country, we poured in millions arms and money supporting the Islamic Mujahideen and Islamic jihadists to drive out the Soviet Union. At the very same time that we were supporting the jihadists and Islamic fundamentalists in Afghanistan, we were fighting the same Islamic fundamentalist group, same kind of an attitude, in Lebanon. In other words, we have had a mixed and contradictory reactions to political Islam. This reaction in part is fed by TV reporting too, in which the TV reporting, or for that matter the movies, in which the stereotypes of a religious fanatics and terrorists is the only thing that is being shown. And the line in this country separating entertainment from information has grown increasingly thin. So you're not being that well informed by much of the media. Now, the point of all of these riddles is not the actual acts themselves. My point is a different one. The point is the lack of wonderment on our part. How come we don't even raise these questions? I want to also talk about other factors contributing to our distorted image of the Middle East, and this is all collapse under the American foreign policy. Remember that the collapse of the Soviet Empire officially brought the Cold War conflict to an end. But it did more than that. It gave us a sense of power because our main rival was gone. Many people in this country, especially the so-called neoconservatives, viewed this as the American moment. Some people call it the opportunity for us to be the sole superpower. Others call it the unipolar moment, the moment in which the United States is the sole superpower with no rivals that even come close to it. And as a sole superpower, the expectation by the neocons was that we would become the beneficent world hegemon and remain so in perpetuity. We have a lot of evidence for this kind of a thinking. One of them was a 1992 defense planning guidance that was leaked to the New York Times. This document was prepared by under Paul Wolfowitz, and I want to just quote a segment of it to make you understand exactly what was the plan. Quote, "To dissuade any potential adversary from pursuing a military buildup in the hope of surpassing or equating the power of the United States." In other words, it doesn't matter whether it's Soviet Union or any other power, including the European power, no one after this moment should surpass United States power. That quote gives you a flavor of the sense of dominion that we had reached with the collapse of the Soviet Union, and that sense of dominion did affect the way we looked at the Middle East, the way we formulated our foreign policy toward the region and toward the rest of the world for that matter. So remember, without the Soviet Union, we didn't have to worry about containing anyone else. And so what was happening really was a shift in our foreign policy motivation. So you can think of the Cold War and the post-Cold War. And one of the things you will see is that our foreign policy motivation changed between the two periods. Up to the ending of the Cold War, really our foreign policy in the Middle East, in my view, was primarily, not exclusively, but primarily was motivated by defensive concern. In other words, we felt that we should protect that region against this terrible foe, the Soviet Union, the evil empire. In fact, although some people on the left may disagree with me, I think the evidence is there for a credible case that the Cold War threat perception was behind a lot of the CIA orchestrated coups in the region and even outside the region, including Latin America. So during the Cold War, our motivation was mostly defensive. However, after the fall of Soviet Union, from 1992 to 2011, I'm stopping right before the 9/11 attack, perception of opportunity really dominated our thinking. So our defensive motivation yielded to the temptation of seeing a tremendous opportunity for us to establish and secure once and for all our hegemonic influence and hegemonic presence in the Middle East. So what we were trying to do in order to establish that was to focus on two really important issues. One was solving the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, because that was an issue that was undermining United States interests in the regions as long as that conflict was continuing. And then the other was the challenge that we were getting to our hegemony, and most of that came from Islamic resurgence and specifically from Iran, because both the Islamicists and Iranians wanted us out of that area. And when I say they wanted us out of that area, I don't mean that they didn't want to have economic relations with the United States. What they really wanted was United States military presence, United States interventionist policy in the area to seize and have normal commercial interest with them. However, by the end of Clinton administration in December of 2000, what had become known as the peace process between the Palestinians and Israelis was functionally dead. It wasn't going anywhere. And at the same time, neither Iran or political Islam was defeated. And yet, despite of this, we had a sense of complacency, in which we thought everything was very stable and to our liking in the Middle East. And then all of a sudden, we get September 11.